40k players love to argue about balance, but here's the question. Now, should Games Workshop fix the game by changing points or by rewriting the rules themselves? Because these two approaches couldn't be more different. Points changes can make weak units really playable overnight, but they don't necessarily stop broken combos, of which we have seen. Rules changes can crush abusive mechanics, but they can also risk confusing players and invalidating armies. So, today, I'm going to be breaking down the pros and the cons of each approach with real examples, and by the end, you're going to know which balance method actually makes the game better for you. This is freaking Warhammer 40,000. Guys, we are heading into balanced data slate territory. Whether it's this week, next week, or even the week after that, we know the balanced data slate is imminent, which is a great thing because this is a very toxic meta we have been in the last few months, where it's basically everything has been Death Guard, Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, and it's just like, I'm very over it, and I'm sure most of you are as well. Well, the points are coming, the rules are coming. Everyone always likes to talk about how the game should be balanced. I'm not going to give you a wish list like some of the other channels have done. I'm actually going to weigh the pros and cons over, do these fixes need points changes or rules changes? In which scenarios does a rules change actually make a lot more sense than a points change, or vice versa? So let's just dive right into this thing. Here's the case for points changes. Going to give you some pros of points changes. So fast to implement and very easy to understand. Great example, we have a ball predator here. It used to cost 135 points. Now it costs 125 points. You don't need to think about anything else. You just know, okay, cool. This is cheaper, and I know what it does. It doesn't change what the unit does. It does the exact same thing that it used to. It's just cheaper or more expensive, depending on what unit you're talking about. The rules stay consistent, which keeps the unit's function the same. Now, one thing that might happen is that when you have cheaper units, it might allow certain weaker units to be able to fulfill the role that you were previously using a more expensive unit for. So, for example, when we saw Ballistus drop down to that 130 point level, everyone was just taking Ballistus as their anti-tank. But then when Ballistus went back up to 140 points, we started seeing people start taking Vindicator tanks again, because the value of the Ballistus at the 130 just wasn't quite as much as what the value is at the 140. It doesn't mean the Ballistus rules have changed. It doesn't mean anything about the Ballistus changed other than the amount of value that you get for the points spent. So this is going to encourage, basically when you do points changes, you're encouraging tons of variety in list building without confusing new rules. Now, what are the cons of list building, of points changes? Well, realistically, it just doesn't fix bad mechanics, whether it's a broken combination or just rules interactions that are just psychopaths. And in this game, you've got some units that are just fundamentally very problematic, no matter what the cost. Historically, Games Workshop has had horrible struggles with aircraft. They've had horrible struggles with indirect. Sometimes it doesn't even matter how expensive indirect firing got. Indirect was just abusive. If you think back to the start of 10th, where any Imperial Guard player could just run 3 mana cores that were, indirect, lethal hits, full reels to hit against everything, hitting on 2s. It was too much. It's too much, and it really almost sometimes doesn't matter how expensive they are. The interaction is just broken, and it means that you can't play into it or against it, which sometimes points aren't necessarily the best case for that. Now, some people will argue, yeah, but if you point things high enough, well, in that case, people still won't take it. Sure, but that would just be removing a unit from the game. It's not... When you just cost something so high that people can't take it, you're more or less just removing the unit from the game. And that's not what we want. We want people to be able to use their models. We want people to be able to use their units. And one last thing is that you've got concept points changes, which can be frustrating to players who might buy and build models only to see them invalidated. Now, I don't necessarily think that this is a very big deal. I do know that some people feel this way, and that doesn't mean you don't feel this way. It just means that I think it's generally a silly way to feel, but that's okay. One example for where points don't really matter all that much is Terminators. Like, yes, okay, if you tell me that I can take a 5-man Terminator squad for 90 points, I'm gonna do it. That's such a ludicrous drop that the reality is that the problem with Terminators and why we're not seeing Terminators in competitive lists, we might see Wolfguard Terminators or like Deathwing Knights, but not your basic Terminators. The reason why we don't see them is because their rule just kind of sucks. It's just not a good rule. I mean, their rule is that they get to have +1 to hit against the Oath of Moment target, which is the target that you're getting full rerolls to hit against. That's a pretty bad rule. Similar to, like, if you take Orc Meganobs have a pretty bad rule. Once per game, for one battle round, when you declare your WA, you get a 5-up Field of Pain. But outside of that, you don't have a rule, which means the unit just doesn't really have a rule, and the rule is useless. You can change the points cost. At a certain point, there's going to be a break point where people are like, sure, I'll just spam these hyper elite units, which makes no sense at all. But these are things where rules changes might actually make more sense. So let's talk about the case for rules changes. Pros of rules changes. You can directly fix broken mechanics. So like, if you think back to 9th edition, oh my gosh. Oh, jeez. Let's talk about the Casterkin combo, where you could just deep strike a Casterkin unit turn 1 using the key of Barbicans. I hate you guard players, and I hate one of you guard players in particular, and you know who I'm talking about. And this one unit could just drop down. It could split fire into 2 different units and just pick up 3 dreadnoughts because it had like full rerolls to hit, full rerolls to wound with devastating wounds. Or it wasn't devastating back then, it was mortals on 6s, but still, it was effectively the same thing. And just one 100-point unit with a 20-point, upgrade or whatever could just deep strike, split fire, and kill 3 Custodes units in one single turn. It was a busted interaction that just really didn't have any counterplay at all. You could have point costed it a bunch more. You could have doubled the cost to make it, say, 240 points instead of 120 or whatever it was. Yeah, but people would still take it because you can just turn 1 deep strike and kill 3 units and win the game. So, when we have rules changes, you can improve clarity and fairness with interactions that are just too darn strong. Another really good example was like, if you guys remember when the Necron Codex was initially released in 10th edition, you had your Immortals who would have the Tesla, and they could spend, I think, 1 CP to get dev wounds on 6s or 5s or something like that. But these guys got to have full rerolls to hit and full rerolls to wound. So they could just fish for double exploding 6s, and then they could get full rerolls to wound when you're on an objective, I believe was the mechanic. And they were doing something ridiculous, like 30 devastating wounds with this one stratagem. So they could have made Immortals cost a lot more, but then you run into the issue where it's like, well, then Immortals are useless in literally any other detachment. So in all reality, the correct thing to do is what they did, which is they just changed the rules. It's like, okay, cool, now this mechanic just can't work this way because you can't use it on Immortals. It's a much better, much more elegant solution to the problem than just making sure that that unit couldn't be taken at all, because if you were going to actually price it at a point where the combination wasn't busted, those Immortals would have had to cost like 350 points or so, something astronomical, which would mean that there's literally no reason that you would ever run Immortals in any detachment other than that one detachment that gave you that stratagem. So basically, it stops points band-aid fixes, and it gets to the root of the freaking problem. So that doesn't mean that points don't have a place, but this is the pro of rules adjustments. You can fix specific mechanics without completely radically destroying everything else around the faction. Now, what are the cons? Be very, very confusing for players. And this is real. And I'm about as I like competitive play about as much as you possibly can. I will say at times it can be a little bit confusing for players because you can have FAQ creep, constant updates, which I love the updates. It's really good, but sometimes it can be a little bit hard to keep up with some of the changes. Now this is being alleviated, and it will continue to be alleviated in the future as Games Workshop is moving towards a more digital rule set way of playing, where just everything's going to be constantly updated digitally. You don't need print manuals anymore. So it's going to make it much easier to keep track of all the changes. So I do think this is something that is being mitigated and will continue to be mitigated even more effectively. But then changes will invalidate knowledge and preparation. It might be harder for competitive players to plan long term. Like, for example, if I am thinking, okay, cool, I have a tournament coming up, I've got a major coming up, and my army is going to rely on the fact that Deathwing Knights are -1 damage. And then suddenly there's a rules update, and now they're no longer -1 damage. Well, that could really change quite a lot of stuff. But to be fair, that's an argument that could be applied to points as well. Like, if I was planning that exact same scenario and then Deathwing Knights also double in cost, that could also screw my plans up as well. So while this is definitely something I hear some people bellyache about, it's really not any different than with points changes. It's the same con. And then the last one would be, it does risk alienating casual players who just want to use their models without relearning rules. I don't really think this is very valid. Like, I know a lot of people who casually play League of Legends, and they don't complain that rules balance updates come in to fix broken characters. Like, I don't know. I just think that's a silly argument, but I do hear it. Basically, what I'm saying is that there aren't many cons for rules adjustments. I'm going to add one more in here, because this actually is pretty important. When you do a rules change, changes can throw off the entire balance for an entire faction. So you have to be really careful when you do this. Throw off balance for entire factions when improperly implemented. And let me explain that. So basically what I mean when I say this is, let's say we're playing Death Guard, and everyone knows that Death Guard need a nerf, whether it's going to be points or rules, whatever. Let's say they wanted to do a rules nerf, and they say, hey, okay, fine. And this is all hypothetical. This is not a leak. I am not saying this is. I'm just using this as an example, guys. Let's say they say, we're going to get rid of the affliction rule, so you can no longer take -1 their armor save. Well, that does kind of effectively mean that everything in Death Guard is going to be 1 AP worse, which could have huge repercussions when you come down to, like, how does this stratagem work? How good is this unit's ability? How good is blah, blah, blah? So it does make things more complicated when you change rules than it does when you just change points. Changing points doesn't really change the complexity of anything, which is nice. All right, so what's better? Should we use points changes or should we use rules changes? Well, I would say that points are best for general balance. They are going to be always useful for nudging armies into line and encouraging variety in list building. I do think points tend to work really well, especially when you have rules that are just solidly working, right? But rules changes are best when mechanics are abusive, unfun, or impossible / inefficient to balance with cost alone. Let me give you an example of something that would be very challenging to fix with points cost alone. Beginning of 10th edition, you had towering, which was a rule that if you just, we still have towering as a rule, but previously what that rule was, you didn't have to touch the terrain. You just ignored terrain for line of sight, which made knights so unreasonably OP. It was ridiculous. Like, so since they're so tall, they could literally just see the entire map, and it would be impossible to hide, and they would just kind of auto-win against any infantry army, basically no matter what. So what you would have had to do if you were trying to balance it with points instead of fixing towering, which they did, thank you, Games Workshop, you did a good job on that. What you would have had to have done is just almost double the cost of knights, which would make them basically unplayable. So it's like, sometimes rules just work a heck of a lot better than points. This also works significantly better when you're balancing detachments, because you will avoid nerfing an entire faction due to one unit in one detachment. Let me give you a great example of that, which we've already kind of spoken about. Let's say that example we spoke about with the Necron Immortals in the previous section. Well, like, had they just tried to fix those Necron Immortals with that interaction with Devastating Wounds, had they tried to fix that with points, they would have legit had to make that unit cost 300 points, which means that you could never take Immortals in any other Necron attachment. You also will run into things like, let's say Penitent Host for Sisters of Battle, right? Let's say they reduce the cost of your Repentia down to be like 90 points, which would make them reasonable in some of the other detachments, but in Penitent Host, it's going to make it the most broken unit in the game. Well, the problem is that maybe they just need to fix the rules that make them so OP in Penitent Host so that they can actually reduce them to a place where they are good in other detachments and aren't only usable in Penitent Host, right? So things like that. All right. Most of the time, I also want to say it should be one or the other. The whole nuking from orbit that GW loves to do, it's gone too far. It needs to go. Like, Death Guard, for example, in this upcoming balanced data slate, they need either significant points nerfs or significant rules nerfs. I don't think they should do both. When they do both, that's how you over nerf things and really screw over the player base. So I just want to see one. And even if it's not enough, let's say they do a significant points nerf, but it turns out that Death Guard's still a little too strong. Continue fixing it in the next data slate. You don't need to over nerf things. It's okay to take things sequentially at a little bit at a time. So hopefully that's what we see. So anyway, here's my final take. Points changes feel a lot less invasive, and rules changes will fix the root problem. I do believe rules changes should be implemented more often than they actually are, but I do understand the other side of the argument. So I want to know from you, though, what do you think? Should balance live and die on points, or should rules be rewritten when they go too far? Guys, if you like the content, like, subscribe, share with your friends. You can join my members only Discord by signing up as a YouTube member or a Coffee member down below. And I will say that we are getting ready to launch our own Warhammer TTS League. So if you want to hop in that, make sure you sign up, because registration is available now. If you're in the Discord, you can get more details for that. So until next time, I love you all, and crump on. Bye-bye.